that not only was I guilty of wasting water but that I had staged the drained pool incident myself to create drama and distract from my own violations. My stomach dropped as I realized she had gone to lengths I hadn't anticipated, manufacturing false evidence with enough polish to cast doubt on everything I had presented. For a moment I felt the tide turn against me as whispers rippled through the crowd, people wondering whether I had indeed concocted the whole story. The betrayal stung even deeper when one of my supposed allies, a neighbor named Luke who had attended our barbecue and grumbled about Jews with the rest of us, stood up and supported Karen's narrative. He claimed he had seen me messing around near the shed late at night, adding fuel to her story. My heart raced as I realized he had likely been feeding information to Karen all along, playing the role of spy while pretending to be part of our resistance. The disappointment was sharp, but worse was the look in the eyes of the neighbors around me, once full of trust and solidarity, now clouded with suspicion. Karen leaned on that suspicion like a maestro conducting her orchestra, weaving a tale of a disgruntled homeowner bent on destroying the community through lies and manipulation. It was her finest performance yet, and for a brief, terrifying moment it looked like she had won. But I wasn't ready to roll over. I stood tall and reminded everyone of the absurd pattern of fines, the lack of improvements despite rising dues, the records Harris had preserved, and the testimony of people who had lived under her reign for years. My voice rose with a mixture of frustration and determination as I asked the room whether they truly believed I could have orchestrated such an elaborate scheme for the sole purpose of, what? Getting a laugh? Wasting water in a drought? The logic of her accusation was thin, and though the falsified photos were convincing at a glance, I pointed out subtle inconsistencies, shadows that didn't align with the time of night they claimed to be taken, timestamps that conveniently matched the night I had been away from home. Still, the damage had been done. Doubt had been planted, and once doubt takes root it is difficult to rip out entirely. The meeting ended in chaos, with Karen smirking and neighbors divided once more, my supposed victory slipping through my fingers. That night was one of the lowest points of the entire ordeal. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the fake photos, anger bubbling inside me, wondering if I had miscalculated, if I had underestimated just how far Karen was willing to go. The betrayal of Luke gnawed at me, his smug expression when he backed her claim replaying in my mind. But the thing about despair is that it often breeds clarity, and as I pored over the documents again I noticed details Karen had overlooked. The invoices she had presented bore signatures of the treasurer who, as Harris had reminded me, had resigned years earlier. The dates didn't match his tenure, meaning the documents were either forged or resurrected from old files. Suddenly a spark ignited in me. Karen's arrogance had pushed her to create evidence so hastily that she left obvious holes, and if I could highlight those holes, I could flip the narrative back in my favor. The next day I called Mark, the accountant neighbor, and showed him the falsified paperwork. His trained eye caught even more discrepancies, calculations that didn't add up, invoice numbers out of sequence, expenses categorized under city codes that no longer existed. With his expertise, the evidence of forgery became undeniable. It wasn't enough to erase the suspicion Karen had cast, but it was enough to sow doubt about her story, the same way she had tried to sow doubt about mine. The thought made me laugh, a bitter but satisfying sound. She had tried to frame me with false evidence, and that false evidence would become her undoing. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued to resist her ridiculous rule in increasingly creative ways. Kids began staging crime scenes with chalk outlines in their driveways labeled unauthorized bicycle parking, and adults wore shirts that read "Find me at block parties," turning her power into a joke. Each attempt at intimidation she made backfired, galvanizing more people against her. Still, she had the official weight of the HOA behind her, and as long as she controlled the paperwork, the fines, and the records, she remained dangerous. My task was to dismantle that power, piece by piece, until the truth stood so starkly that no performance of hers could cover it. One evening, determined to uncover the final piece I needed, I set up a stakeout near the HOA shed, hiding in the shadows with my camera. Hours ticked by until finally Karen herself arrived, accompanied by Luke, carrying boxes into the shed. I crept closer, heart pounding, and snapped photos of the scene. When they left, I snuck forward and found the boxes filled with shredded documents, fragments of financial records that she was trying to destroy. My hands shook as I scooped up as much as I could, stuffing the scraps into bags. Back home, I spread them across my table like puzzle pieces, and with Harris and Mark's help we began piecing them together. It was slow, tedious work, but even from partial pages we uncovered damning evidence: receipts for spa treatments, luxury handbags, and even a weekend getaway labeled board retreat charged directly to HOA funds. The laughter came naturally then, bubbling out of me despite the hour, because the queen of the HOA, the woman who fined me for the shade of my trash bin, had been living lavishly on everyone's dime. The neighborhood was no longer the quiet collection of manicured lawns and neatly parked cars it had once been, but a place where tension hung in the air heavier than the summer heat, and as the next HOA meeting approached I knew that everything I had endured, every sleepless night and every ridiculous violation, had been leading to this moment where the truth could no longer be hidden. The stack of evidence I carried with me felt like both a shield and a sword, each document, photo, and witness statement a piece of ammunition that could finally pierce the armor of Karen's lies. Yet as confident as I felt, I also understood the stakes had never been higher, because if she managed to wriggle out of this trap the way she had before, I would not only lose the battle but likely my home, my reputation, and any chance of living in peace. Karen had proven she was willing to fabricate, manipulate, and destroy evidence to maintain her hold on the community, and I braced myself for her final act of desperation. The meeting was held in the community center this time, a deliberate change after the uproar at her house, and as I entered the room I saw it packed with neighbors, some clutching violation notices, others whispering nervously, and all of them waiting for the showdown they knew was coming. Karen sat at the head of the table like a monarch on her throne, gavel in hand, flanked by her dwindling circle of loyalists who looked less confident than usual, their eyes darting between the crowd and the pile of documents in front of her. She opened the meeting with her usual self-importance, lecturing us about community values and the dangers of insubordination, but there was a tremor in her voice, a hint of the pressure that was finally cracking her mask. When my turn came to speak I stood, unrolled the dossier, and began to present it piece by piece, starting with the shredded documents we had painstakingly reconstructed. The receipts for spa treatments, the handbags, the board retreat weekend in Las Vegas, all charged to the HOA fund, were projected on the screen for everyone to see. Murmurs erupted across the room, eyes widened, and for once it wasn't me they doubted. Karen attempted to laugh it off, insisting the documents were taken out of context, that the expenses had been approved by the treasurer, but that was when I struck with the next blow, revealing the resignation letter of the treasurer dated 2 years before the receipts. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the gasp of someone in the back row. I then played the recording of Karen herself mentioning the maintenance crew in connection with the drained pool, her own voice betraying her involvement. The room buzzed again, people leaning forward, their trust in her crumbling by the second. Karen's smile faltered, but she quickly tried to recover, pulling out the falsified photos she had presented at the last meeting. She held them up, waving them as proof of my supposed guilt, but I was ready. I had Mark, the accountant, stand and explain the inconsistencies in the documents she had provided, his calm voice outlining each error with the precision of a surgeon. The shadows in the photos, the mismatched timestamps, the outdated codes in the invoices, all dissected in front of the entire community until her once powerful evidence looked like a child's forgery project. But the moment that truly broke her grip came when Harris, frail but resolute, stood up and walked slowly to the front, binder in hand. He laid it on the table and flipped through years of records, showing the community how long they had been paying for improvements that never came, his voice rising with emotion as he recounted the promises broken and the money wasted. It was a dramatic moment, the kind that silences a crowd and etches itself into memory, and for the first time I saw fear in Karen's eyes. She tried to shout him down, slamming her gavel, but the sound only made her look desperate, her authority slipping with every word. Neighbors began shouting their own grievances, one after another, voices overlapping in a storm of anger that even Karen couldn't control. The once obedient subjects were rebelling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Sensing her power collapsing, Karen attempted one last maneuver. She announced that she had already contacted the city and reported me for water theft, claiming that outside authorities would soon descend upon me and expose my lies. It was meant to be a death blow, a final humiliation to turn the tide back in her favor. But this time I was ready with my strongest card. I produced the footage from my camera showing her and Luke hauling boxes of shredded documents into the shed, the timestamp aligned with the night she claimed I was siphoning water. The room erupted in outrage, people shouting accusations, others demanding her resignation on the spot. The evidence was undeniable, her guilt as clear as the drained basin of my pool. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders as the community turned against her, their anger no longer directed at me but at the woman who had abused her power for years. The drama of the moment was matched only by its humor, because as she tried to defend herself, shouting about loyalty and rules, someone in the back held up a giant inflatable flamingo, the same one that had been placed in my empty pool as a prank, and waved it like a flag of rebellion. Laughter erupted, spreading through the crowd until it drowned out her protests, the ridiculous bird becoming the symbol of her downfall. Karen, red-faced and sputtering, slammed her gavel one final time and stormed out of the room, leaving her loyalists scrambling in her wake. The meeting dissolved into chaos, but it was the chaos of liberation, neighbors hugging, laughing, and marveling at the fact that the reign of fines and fear was finally over. Yet as satisfying as that moment was, I knew the battle wasn't truly finished. Karen still held the official title, and until the board formally voted her out, she could attempt to claw her way back. But the tide had turned irreversibly. Over the next few days, petitions circulated, signatures piled up, and demands for her resignation flooded her mailbox. The city inspector she had threatened to unleash on me actually arrived, but after reviewing my evidence he shook his head, muttering that he had never seen such a blatant misuse of authority. He promised to forward the financial irregularities to the proper offices, hinting that Karen's troubles might soon extend far beyond our neighborhood. It was the kind of twist that made me laugh out loud, the woman who fined me for wind chimes about to face real legal consequences for fraud. In the meantime, the neighborhood began to change in small but profound ways. People who had once avoided eye contact now waved cheerfully, children played in the streets without fear of being scolded for riding bikes too loudly, and a sense of freedom spread like wildfire. My empty pool, once a symbol of humiliation, became a gathering place where neighbors sat on lawn chairs inside the basin, laughing and toasting to Karen's downfall. Someone even painted slogans on the dry floor, phrases like community not control and no more fines, turning the space into a monument of defiance. The irony was not lost on me, and though I longed to refill the pool, I decided to leave it empty just a little longer, a reminder of the battle we had fought and the empire we had toppled. The final act of the saga began quietly, almost deceptively, as if the storm had passed and the neighborhood had slipped back into normalcy, but beneath the surface there was a restless current because everyone knew Karen was not the kind of person to surrender without one last desperate swing. Days passed with an eerie stillness, her house shuttered, her clipboard unseen, but the silence only made people more uneasy, like waiting for a firecracker to explode long after the fuse had burned out. I spent those days preparing, double-checking the evidence, securing copies of everything, ensuring that even if she tried to erase records or retaliate, the truth could not be buried again. And then, one morning, it happened. Thick envelopes arrived in our mailboxes, each one a final attempt by Karen to reassert dominance. Inside was a sweeping set of violation notices, not just for me but for nearly every household in the neighborhood, citing everything from improperly stored holiday decorations to unauthorized lawn ornaments. The desperation bled from every word. It was her last card, a carpet bombing of fines meant to remind everyone that technically she still held the title of HOA president and could wield it like a weapon. But this time, the reaction was not fear. It was fury. Neighbors gathered in my driveway, clutching their envelopes with outrage and disbelief, their voices rising in unison, and for the first time I saw a community fully united, no longer afraid of her retaliation. People who had once kept quiet out of fear of fines now laughed bitterly as they read their absurd violations aloud, turning the moment into a rally rather than a defeat. It was clear that Karen's reign was finished not just in spirit but in practice, and the only thing left was to formalize her removal. A special meeting was called, and this time the turnout was unlike anything I had seen before. The community center was packed wall to wall, the air thick with anticipation and impatience, neighbors who had once barely spoken to each other now standing shoulder to shoulder, bound by the shared desire to see the tyrant toppled. Karen arrived late, dressed in her usual pristine blouse but lacking her usual confidence, her eyes darting nervously as she sat down at the head table. The gavel in her hand trembled slightly as she tried to call the meeting to order, but the noise of the crowd drowned her out. Voices shouted for her resignation, demands echoed from every corner, and when she finally managed to raise her voice above the din, it was not the voice of a ruler but of a desperate woman clinging to control. She accused us all of betrayal, of conspiring against her, of destroying the very community she had built. Her words fell flat, met not with obedience but with laughter and jeers. For the first time she looked small, dwarfed not by her stature but by the sheer collective will of the people she had bullied for years. That was when I stepped forward, carrying the dossier in my hands, and addressed the room not with anger but with calm certainty. I laid out the evidence one final time, the receipts for personal expenses disguised as HOA costs, the recordings of her slips, the testimony of neighbors, and the footage of her late-night shredding session. Each piece landed like a hammer on stone, breaking apart what little credibility she had left. And then I looked directly at her and asked the question that silenced the room. If you truly cared about this community, why is there nothing to show for years of rising dues? The weight of the silence that followed crushed her last defense, because everyone in that room knew the truth. The playground had never been fixed, the clubhouse remained broken, the streets untouched, and yet our money had vanished. She had no answer. The vote to remove her was swift and decisive. Ballots were passed, hands were raised, and when the final count was read aloud, Karen was officially stripped of her position. The room erupted in cheers, applause, and laughter, a wave of relief that washed over everyone as though chains had been broken. Karen stood, her face pale and her hands shaking, and for a moment I almost pitied her, but then I remembered the drained pool, the fabricated fines, the endless harassment, and I felt nothing but satisfaction as she stormed out of the building, her gavel left abandoned on the table like a relic of a failed kingdom. The neighborhood celebrated that night with an energy I had never seen before. People spilled out into the streets, children rode bikes freely, and someone even set up speakers and blasted music while neighbors danced under the stars. It was a liberation party, a spontaneous eruption of joy that proved we had taken back our community. But the sweetest moment came days later when a city official arrived to address the financial irregularities uncovered in our investigation. He confirmed what we had long suspected. Karen had been siphoning money for personal use, and she now faced not just the scorn of her neighbors but real legal consequences. News spread quickly, and before long Karen's name became synonymous with scandal, whispered in disbelief not just in our neighborhood but in nearby communities as well. The woman who had fined me for grass being too green was now facing fines of her own, fines that came with court dates and auditors, not laminated rulebooks. It was poetic justice, the kind that makes you laugh even as you shake your head at the absurdity of it all. In the aftermath, the neighborhood transformed in ways that felt almost surreal. Without Karen's constant surveillance, people breathed easier. Gardens bloomed with colors once banned, children left toys in front yards without fear of citations, and holiday decorations lingered joyfully long past arbitrary deadlines. The new interim president, a soft-spoken retiree named Ellen, promised transparency and fairness, and her very first act was to suspend all outstanding fines issued under Karen's rule. She even announced plans to refund a portion of dues once the stolen funds were recovered, a gesture that drew cheers from the crowd. For the first time since moving there I felt like I truly lived in a community rather than a dictatorship, a place of laughter and camaraderie instead of suspicion and fear. As for my pool, it was finally refilled, shimmering once more under the sun. To celebrate, I invited the entire neighborhood for a pool party, a gathering that symbolized not just my personal vindication but our collective triumph. Families arrived with food and drinks, children splashed in the water, and even Harris, cane in hand, dipped his feet at the shallow end while chuckling at the absurd journey we had all endured. At one point Janet raised her glass and declared that the pool, once a symbol of division, had become the heart of our neighborhood, and everyone erupted in cheers. Someone even floated the inflatable flamingo across the water, and this time it was not a joke at my expense but a banner of victory,